schools. Give me just a moment while I work on muting some of all these wonderful chimes that are going on in my background. Thank you so much for spending your afternoon with us. We appreciate it, and I'm excited to hear the feedback that you'll be offering us tonight. All right, we're gonna go ahead to the next slide. So I thought that this was going to be a webinar. I was mistaken, but it's a regular Zoom, and we've been Zooming for a while, but just in case you forgot, on your laptop, there's this desktop icon if you're in the Zoom app that will allow you to mute yourself, cut your video off, and access chat. Let's be good stewards of Zoom and unmute ourselves only when we're asked to speak, and then try to be sure to keep that mute button on off until you're asked to speak. Also, we'll be using our chat for Q&A, so please drop any of your questions in the chat. We have facilitators on standby that can jump into the chat at any time to answer your questions. And if you're on a mobile device and you're trying to get our attention and you can't find your chat or your emojis or anything, if you tap your screen, you can definitely see it pop up in the window next to you or the window on your screen, and you'll see the chat access there. And if you're dialing in, which I don't see any dial-in folks, but just in case, *6 will grab our attention and raises your hand. Next slide, please. All right, so will this be the only opportunity for us to have feedback on the new student assignment policy? No, there will be lots of other workshops happening. As you can see from the screen, a few of them have happened, and we've got some planned in the future where you can have a much deeper dive into the conversation. Also, if you want to stay informed and engaged and be sure you don't miss any of those websites, you can log on to the student assignment website and sign up for our newsletter. And that way you'll never miss anything that's happening.
Marisha, you're muted. Oh.
We will go over a few things. We'll go over the overview of the policy. We'll learn a little bit more about it. We'll see where we're at in the phase of the policy. We'll have definitely some time for discussion and Q&A. And then we'll wrap up with some closing things.
Before we move on, we have our ASL interpreters in the room. Can we let them make an announcement and let families know how they can view ASL interpretation? Thank you.
I need access to my camera.
Okay. I'm unable to do that. Can somebody do that? Wilson, can you Wilson, can you please look for ASL interpreter Sean and Susie and give them video access, please?
Sean, can you turn on your video, or can you not turn on your video?
I can now, thank you.
Okay, great.
You want to go ahead, Marisha?
Sure, thank you.
Just a quick introduction. I'm ASL Interpreter Sean. There'll be another interpreter, Susie, who'll be joining me in a minute. If you need access to ASL, please look at my frame, and at the top right corner, you'll see some dots. Click on that and you can pin me. Thank you and enjoy the workshop.
Thank you, Sean, for that. So to get into our purpose for today's workshop is today is an opportunity for us to have a conversation with the folks that are on this Zoom to learn more about what the work SFUSD is doing to develop zones for the new student assignment policy, and also to provide feedback that will help make sure the zones meet the needs of San Francisco children and their families. Next slide. So the Board of Education adopted a new zone-based elementary school assignment process to replace the current district-wide choice policy. This new policy won't impact current SFUSD students. The earliest that this policy will go into effect is for students entering elementary school in the fall of 2024. We are in the implement phase of this process. And during this implementation phase, there'll be many opportunities for community input. And this is just one of several workshops that we're hosting all around the city to hear from community members this fall. All the input that we gather will be important to help shape what the zones will look like. So some of the goals for tonight are for families to learn about changes to the elementary school student assignment system, to learn about our project line, and then the approaches we'll be using to developing elementary school zone boundaries. SFUSD staff will learn about families' hopes, ideas, concerns related to the different approaches for developing boundaries. So we're going to do a quick and super quick virtual connector that I will have some conversation through. But if you all have access to the chat, which I'm not sure, but if you do, feel free to put your name in there and say what your connection is to SFUSD. Hi, Doug, welcome. Hi, Leah. All right, looks like you guys can access that chat. I'm gonna move us on to the student assignment policy overview, but please feel free to use that chat for questions and introducing yourself. All right, so a little bit about the board resolution. So board resolution 5101.2 was put into place on December 8th, 2020 after a 2-year policy development process. The board approved a new policy for elementary student assignment. Some of the problems with our current system are schools are segregated by income and race and ethnicity. The current I got all the frogs in my throat today. I'm gonna shake them though, y'all. They're gonna go away. The enrollment process is complicated for families. It isn't predictable or transparent enough, and not everyone has equitable access to the choice process. And families are traveling across the city to attend school, which is creating a barrier to strong community connections. So our policy goals. There are some core values that have helped shape the new policy. Some of those values are a commitment to ensuring every student has access to quality schools. Students are best served in diverse learning environments, and student assignments should be easy for families, and it should be the start of a positive relationship between SFUSD and families. These values informed our goals for student assignment. The new zone-based student assignment system will strive to achieve all of these goals of diversity, proximity, and predictability. We also want to acknowledge the feedback we've received over the years from parents and others like you. We know that school quality is incredibly important, and we recognize that student assignment alone cannot create high quality schools, and a lot of things we have to shift alongside student assignment. We know that student assignment is not going to solve every problem, but it does have a role to play. Student assignment has a role to play in creating racially and socioeconomically integrated schools. We can also design a system that's simpler, easier, and more predictable for families and encourages stronger connections between schools and their local communities. We'll talk about the timeline next. So this is our timeline. Right now, we're in that long blue arrow that says implement, and we're in the beginning of that phase. And during all of the phases in our timeline, there'll be multiple opportunities for the community to give feedback along the way. We'll have different workshops. There's an ad hoc committee on student assignment. There'll be some town halls, and we also have surveys. Let's get into the policy. The policy. Let's talk about how the new student assignment policy will work. There are 3 elements to the new policy. There are zones, diversity categories, and tiebreakers. Zones determine how schools are grouped together within a boundary. Diversity categories and tiebreakers influence how students are assigned to schools in their zone. Today, though, we will mainly focus on zones. In future discussions, we'll provide more details about diversity categories and tiebreakers, but nothing can happen until we get schools and students organized into zones. Let's dig deeper into the zones. So understanding our zones. Again, families, please feel free to use the chat to ask any questions that you may have. Zones are boundaries that are drawn around elementary schools. Zones will be used to determine which schools and programs students are eligible to apply for. Boundaries will be drawn intentionally to promote diversity and will take into consideration geography, traffic patterns, and community feedback. Zones support proximity and they increase predictability. It is important to know that every student will still have access to general education options. Every student will still have access to K-8 schools. Every student will still have access to language pathways, and every student will still have access to special education programs. All right. So here's another timeline. Earlier, we looked at a timeline that was the whole project timeline. Now we're viewing a timeline that is for building our zone boundaries. Right now, in fall of 2021, we're gathering input from the community to help us make decisions to draft the proposed zones. We'll bring those zones back to the community for more specific feedback in the spring. All right. Here's our time to talk about and get feedback from you all in the audience. So we're going to move into our feedback sessions. During these feedback sessions, SFUSD hopes to learn what community members think about the different approaches we're going to discuss to building zones. What questions or concerns the community might have that need to be answered before drawing new zones and boundary. And then these feedback sessions are also an option for the community to ask specific questions and provide us feedback and input on the different approaches to the zones. So we will be sharing feedback. Families are able to share feedback with us in this session through surveys, through a survey. We'll also have some time to chat amongst each other and to answer Q&A in the chat as well. Some norms we want to keep in mind are that everyone listens and everyone is able to ask questions. We will share from our heart your truth, your perspectives, and your experiences, and be respectful of others. During your survey, write just enough, but be concise. The survey link is located down there, and it will end up in the chat in just a little while. Oh, it's there already. Yay. So our first topic of defining diversity. We know that we want zones to be diverse, but we have to figure out how to do that. Some things we already know to be true is that each zone must be within 15% of the district average for free or reduced price meals, and no individual student characteristics can be taken into account. But what else should be true about zones, about how zones are diverse? And this is where we need your input. We're going to talk about defining diversity across our zones, but let's think about the characteristics of diversity to include. Next slide. While we're thinking about defining diversity and what characteristics of diversity to include, what characteristics do you consider? Can you could think of some examples on this slide or take a minute or two to think. So the prompt was, what characteristics of diversity do you consider? Is there anyone that wants to type into the chat or share verbally a characteristic that they are considering? As we move through this conversation, please hold that characteristic in mind. SFUSD will definitely consider multiple characteristics when building zones, and we don't need to choose from just one. For each characteristic, we need to define an approach or a rule that will ultimately impact how the zone is built based on that characteristic. Using the characteristic that you're storing in your head or one from the previous slide, think about how you would define your chosen characteristic inside of a zone. Is there anyone who wants to say what a school might look like or feel like, or how the school environment might feel? What might you see inside of a school? Thank you, Emily. I see race. Remember, as we move through this conversation, keep some of those characteristics in mind to help you apply them to the different approaches we're going to use. Next slide. On this slide, you can see that we've proposed two different approaches to build diverse zone. Each approach results in different boundaries for our zones. Let's take a closer look to understand these approaches. The task to build diverse zones and the first approach is to make each zone similar to San Francisco overall. And you might like this approach if you want each zone to have the same distribution of your characteristic as SFUSD overall, or you want each zone close to the district average. Our next approach, approach 2, is less restrictive than approach 1. It doesn't require that each zone is the same or the same as the district average. Instead, it lets zone be different as long as no zones completely goes out of whack. I'm going to stop here and do a check for understanding. If there's someone that would like to read the examples from the other slides, I welcome that help. Okay. Alrighty. So now that we have our two different approaches for diversity, let's compare them side by side. There's approach 1 and approach 2. So approach 2 is less restrictive than approach 1, but approach 1 requires each zone to be similar to the overall district average. So if you use the example of the diversity category for race, your school, the schools in your zones would mirror what the district average is, or close to what the district average is. Or if you used approach 2, there would be no over-concentration of one particular race in the schools located in your zone. Now some time for input and feedback.
Marisha, how do you want people to share their feedback?
So folks can share feedback in the chat. They can unmic and mute, or unmute and share out loud. They can raise their hand, but we have some time for some open dialogue and conversation. So whichever way is most convenient. I do see that, oh, Paul, there it goes. He asked for the survey link again. The survey also has questions for the next set of things we're going to discuss. But for now, I really would love to hear from the families on the call about how these approaches to diversity might impact them in enrolling their little ones.
Hi there. I have a question. How will you take into account that most neighborhoods in San Francisco, or I find neighborhoods in San Francisco to not be that diverse? And so like if you're doing approach 2 and you want to avoid over concentration of any group in any zone, I guess I have a hard time seeing how that would be operationalized if you're trying to also keep zones within a certain like proximity.
Yes, that is true. And thank you for that question and feedback. I welcome some of the other facilitators who facilitated small groups to answer that question as well. I'm going to grab some notes to make sure that I'm answering correctly.
This is a really good question, actually. Thank you so much for asking it. I think what's important for us to keep in mind is we're working with some researchers from Stanford, and as we build the zones, they'll incorporate pieces of different neighborhoods. So we'll be able to make the zones relatively diverse by using cross sections of San Francisco. The next piece that we'll talk about how big those cross sections should be and how many schools should be included, because we know that that's really important. But you're right, in an attempt to get away from the lack of diversity in some San Francisco neighborhoods, we'll be incorporating different neighborhoods to make sure that we have diversity.
Are there any other questions?
Hi, this is Jeanette here. I was wondering how language programs would factor into that, because one thing I noticed when doing my homework ahead of enrolling my kindergartner for next year was that the school demographics would switch incredibly once we looked at, a Spanish immersion program. And so that was something that I was thinking about a lot of Spanish speakers.
Can you repeat the beginning of the question, please?
Well, how like factoring in this diversity with the schools that have different language programs, and I'm still kind of learning about them, but some of them, if they have like, I think it's immersion, right? Spanish immersion, Mandarin immersion, or Cantonese. And I noticed looking at the demographics of those schools, like how it would switch if, depending on the language program. And so like in the neighborhood we're in, there's no Spanish immersion program. And so thinking about what school I'd want to enroll my daughter in to have that program would be in a whole different neighborhood, in another part of the city.
Got it. So as we redesign the system and draw the zones and boundaries, we're also working on how we may need to expand or increase or decrease our programs within certain schools and certain areas. So those pieces are moving kind of simultaneously, but we won't have definite answers for what that may look like for the community until we can land on some temporary zones.
Just a note on that also, Jeanette, every family will still have access to language programs. So even if you don't live close to a school with language programs, you will be able to access them through the zone model. In the chat, Marisha, I see, wondering if there's a plan to address older siblings who are already enrolled in school. Will this still be used as a tiebreaker? The answer to that is yeah. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead, Leah. Yes, so students who have older siblings enrolled in a school that's not in their new smaller zone, you will still be able to apply to that school and you will still have a tiebreaker at that school. Our goal is not to separate families from each other. I see another question. Do you have an idea yet of how many zones you are looking to divide the district into? This is an excellent question. It's actually the next thing we're going to talk about. So really great segue. We'll get there in a second. I see Miranda's got some siblings answer in the chat and also an answer from Orla. Thank you. From Michael, will there still be citywide schools under the new plan? The answer to that is it's not clear yet. Thanks, Orla. Alrighty, Marisha, before we move on, do you want people to add their answers to this question to the survey?
Sure, if families feel comfortable navigating between two screens, the survey and us in our Zoom window, they're more than happy to answer some of the questions in the survey. It'll present as a demographic information first, and then the area to give input will come after that.
Great. I think we heard a lot of questions. I'm curious whether people like approach 1 or approach 2 better, and whether anybody would like to share their answer to that question. All right, if not, Marisha, let's go ahead to second topic.
Thank you. All right, our second topic is going to be zone and distance. Size and distance, I'm sorry. This topic has to do with how we build zones that are the right size for families to make it reasonable to travel within the zone and to still give families some options. What will definitely be true about size and distance is that we will use medium-sized zones with 8 to 12 schools in each zone. Every student will have access to general education options, K-8 schools, language pathways, and special education programs. What else should be true about determining zone sizes is where we'll need your input. To determine zone size, the first approach could be to create larger zones with more options for each family, but that would mean some families have to travel far from home to reach their school. A quick reminder here is that no matter the size of each zone will always include ways for students to access K-8 schools, language pathways, and special education programs. So approach number 2. We could create smaller zones that have fewer options, but make sure families are closer to home. I'm going to pull the slide so I can read it a little bit for you guys. What this would mean for families is that they would have smaller number of options, but most options would be relatively close to home. And you might like this if enrolling in school closer to home is your top priority, or you would prefer to choose a school closer to you that you like rather than travel further to your ideal school. Now we're going to take some time to look at these approaches side by side. So thinking about these 2 different approaches for zone size and school choices, what do you think? What do you like and what questions may you have? How to define the distance by far or near? Is transportation or walking distance? We are currently considering both of those, or all the options of how folks get to and from school as we think about designing zone sizes. But Emily, what would be your preferred mode of transportation to school? Driving. And if you were driving in your car, would you choose to have your options be closer? Or would you choose for them to be further? For your ideal school to be in your zone that's closer to you or further away? So something over a 30-minute drive would seem not okay in a car. Thank you for sharing that. Are there others who want to chime in about how many, about zones being smaller or larger? Thank you, Renee. I see your comment in the chat that a preference of walking distance to a school or something that takes only one muni to get there. Are there others who want to chime in? Feel free to unmic as well or unmute. If you have that survey open, you're welcome to go into there and write your responses down there as well. I'll leave a little bit of space for you guys to navigate to that. Thank you for sharing, Jeanette, for the thought of looking for schools on your way to work as well. Yes, Mary, we will be taking into consideration all of the different pathways and geography and all those things. Okay, so we're coming almost to the close of our conversation, but we're gonna drop the chat again for the survey link. It's really important that we get as much of that filled out as we can from families. But also, I really want to open this up for you all to ask any questions you may have as designing the zones cannot be done without community input. And so while you have a space here to share, it would be really great to hear, especially from our families who are incoming or even our current families in the district about this zone policy and the things that they would like to see within the zones that will be related to where they'll send their kids to. Paul, oops.
Hi, it's Mary again. I had another question. I know we've been talking about language schools, but there's also, I'm interested in that I see one extended school year school option at Argonne, and I'm curious if there are plans to include other more like year-round school options outside of just the one as you look to rezone.
Yes, I'm gonna ask either Lauren or Orla to chime in, but I believe extended school year right now is offered for certain families, but I'll let one of them chime in because I can't give that answer.
Yeah, extended school year is available for students with IEPs. And we do have one school at the moment in the city that has a calendar that's not the same as all other calendars, and that's Argonne, and that has is a year-round school, so it takes a much smaller summer recess.
And Mary, you're asking if that's a possibility with the new zones for other schools to adopt a similar schedule?
Well, yeah, like similar in concept to, like I see in the chat, there's a question about more language option schools. And I was wondering if you kind of bucketed extended year as another sort of like, option, like a language school, that there's maybe only one or two kind of citywide. Like if, as you look to rezone, you would be adding more of those sort of schools with special focuses into the mix.
We have not contemplated that in our conversation so far, but it doesn't mean to say that it won't be part of the conversation moving forward. And I think that the way we think about programs and school opportunities, academic opportunities, is in a very dynamic way, and that the district will always be kind of iterating and trying to create opportunities that better meet the needs and desires of families. And that no matter what student assignment system we have, that would be true. As we're creating zones, we'll want to make sure that those opportunities are distributed and that everyone, regardless of where they live in the city, has access to unique opportunities. So I would imagine in a situation where there's only one of something, and this is all theoretical because we're definitely in the sausage making, and your input and your questions are going to help us draft the zones. But the way we're currently thinking about it is that if there's something that's limited to one site, we would need to make sure everyone in the city had access to that as well.
Thank you.
Mary, that was a really good question, because I think that this is one of the things that we could consider as we're thinking about distribution of programs across zones. So your input here is really valuable because it helps us think about what other options we might include to make this exciting for families. And go ahead, Marisha.
No, it's okay. I'm good. Thanks for that question. Emily, I see you're asking about working address. Unfortunately, we're home addresses or census block data is what's being used for us to help design zones. We can't use students' individual information, and we would have to ask each family that. We can't use students' individual information to help us when we're designing and drafting the zones, but we can use census data and block data for that. So working addresses will not affect the zone.
And Emily, this is a really good question, because right now we're planning to have families apply for the zone that is closest to their home, or be in the zone in which their home is. But it sounds like there's a lot of interest in work address.
Paul, was your question answered about the pathways and programs?
No, not quite. I know it was talked about Spanish earlier, but for Korean and for Mandarin, there's only one or two schools that currently offer that. And I'm not entirely sure how many zones would potentially be set up, but I presume it's more than one or two. So is the intention to have those lesser common languages available for all zones, or would it just be one or two languages and everyone has to choose from one of those two per zone? Say, for example, just Spanish and Cantonese and not Korean, and as an example.
Yes,
We
just
haven't-
as, oh, go ahead.
Sorry, Marisha.
I was just going to reference, just as we were talking about as extended school year, the same thing will be applied to the language path. There has to be some way for all families to have access to it. Orla, you can elaborate if you like.
No, I think you said it spot on, Marisha, that, we haven't, as we're drawing the zones, that will be part of what we're thinking about, how we do it in a way that gives everybody access. And obviously some programs and pathways are in more schools, are more available than others. And so then that would impact how the zones are drawn.
Okay, thank you.
New message. What zones considered?
I'm happy to take that if you like, Marisha.
Thank
So
you,
there's a-
Orla.
There's a question about the zones considering start or finish times of schools and making sure there's a good distribution. So we are actually planning to survey families about start times as we work to develop zones, and transportation is going to be a major factor as we're thinking, because one of the goals is to make the proximity as a goal. And so as we think about ease of access, making it easy for all families to access the schools within their zones, we are thinking about the transportation infrastructure that would be required, and also thinking about start and end times.
All right. Thank you for your question, Leah. Thank you for the response, Orla. Yes, I'll answer out loud. So the recorded versions of all of today's sessions will be at sfusd.edu /fair.
I'm going to drop the link to the survey in the chat one more time. And I would like to ask everybody to please make sure that you are filling out the survey. This will help us capture your thoughts and answers so that we know for each person on this call, you don't need to record your personal information, but we're curious about whether you prefer for the first question about diversity, option 1 or option 2. And for the second question about size and distance, school or zones that have more schools but are potentially larger, or zones that have fewer schools that are potentially a little bit smaller. So please, please, please make sure that you fill that survey out. Marisha, are you ready to go on?
Yep, I think we are wrapping up. That's all. So again, thank you guys for spending the afternoon with us. The ways that you can stay informed about student assignment is to go to the student assignment website on SFUSD. There's an email list that you can join that will give you the most updated information, as well as the website. We are hosting another in-depth workshop on November 4th with our Parent Advisory Council, SFUSD's Parent Advisory Council, so the PAC, and the link for that's not available yet, but it will be available once we get it, and we'll post it on the student assignment website. Also, you're able to give comment at board meetings and public comment during at the upcoming board meetings or our ad hoc committee meetings as well. And if we don't have any other questions, our discussion is over for this afternoon, and we thank you all for joining.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you so much for helping us with this. The links will be available, or the recordings, on our website next week. Thank you so much. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you, everybody. And our next ad hoc committee on student assignment is on Monday, November 15th. And we'll be sharing out the feedback we've heard from these sessions at that. And we'd love if you were able to join and be part of that conversation as well.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.